Obviously, punk music is still a genre today, and we won't cover like all of it, the whole genre in this episode. We'll just kind of talk about like the beginnings and where it came from and like that initial explosion of punk music. So what do you know about punk that's not pop punk?
Not a lot.
Not a lot.
Anger, emotions.
Yeah.
I have emotions. Sometimes I like to hear emotions.
Okay. Well, punk emerged as a kind of successor to the rebellious attitude of rock and roll. In the 60s, the rock music was very much rebellious. The parents hated it. It was pushing back against that. By this point in the 70s, the mid-70s, that kind of music started to become very tame. So they needed something to fill that rebellious, edgy void. Tommy Ramone, who was the drummer of the Ramones, said, quote, "In its initial form, a lot of 1960s stuff was innovative and exciting. Unfortunately, what happened is that people who could not hold a candle to the likes of Hendrix started noodling away. Soon you had endless solos that went nowhere."
That is so funny. That is amazing.
Yeah. By 1973, I knew that what was needed was some pure, stripped-down, no BS rock and roll. End quote.
I'm glad that he could come in and fix music.
Many of the early punk musicians saw it as a return to the roots of rock and roll. The founder of Punk Magazine said that in the 70s, rock got so watered down that people like Billy Joel and Simon and Garfunkel were considered rock, which was a travesty.
If you care that much, I guess. I love the music, but I swear to God, everyone is a pretentious asshole.
That's true of pretty much every genre.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to find a genre that's full of, like, humble, non-pretentious people. These people kind of started realizing that they needed to breathe some fresh air into the rock scene. Let's go! Typically, kind of talking about the essence of what punk music is now before we go into the history of it. Punk music is very stripped down. It features one or maybe two guitars, a bass, drums, and a singer. Through psychedelic rock and funk and other stuff, we saw rock music kind of balloon up to incorporate many different elements, like synthesizers and horn sections and all kinds of stuff happening. So punk stripped it all away. Punk was aggressive, full of energy, and often political. The songs were fast-tempo and very short. The artists rejected a lot of what made mainstream music mainstream. Most of the early punk bands embraced the kind of do-it-yourself attitude, which let them exist on the fringes and find their own niche and build their own little audiences. Most of the major punk acts grew up in very urban environments like New York, Los Angeles, London, etc., so the energy made sense and it felt like a reclaiming of the inner city. Punk music grew to really define teenage angst in the same way that rock of the 60s did. It was the same attitude as like the Rolling Stones or Little Richard, just louder, more aggressive, stripped down, and a whole lot angrier. I got a feeling inside of me. Well, that's what it was, so let's take a look at where it came from now. The foreground of punk was, I've never used that word, so that's interesting.
Foreground? What were you on when you're right? What's happening here?
I don't know that I've ever used that word. I don't even know if, I think background is more, whatever. The initial elements of punk was really laid by the garage rock bands of the 60s. A lot of these bands, like the Sonics, just wanted to mess around. They were not trained musicians, and they really had no interest in learning how to play music correctly. They were able to break the rules of music because they didn't really care to even know what the rules of music were.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
It's really weird how we like put rules to something that doesn't need to have rules, but then it's like you have to know the rules in order to know how to break them. And it's like, well, you could also just like do it.
Yeah.
If you wanted to.
In Detroit, two bands started to gain a lot of attention. They were known as the Stooges and MC5. They were loud, disruptive, and often political. Their concerts would often end in violence, and they started to open up the eyes of the music world to this new sound. The Stooges were led by a drummer-turned-singer named Iggy Pop. He wanted to create a new blues music that was not derivative of earlier stuff and took heavy influence from garage bands like the Sonics and the Kinks. The Stooges became known for their wild stage performances around Detroit, especially the antics of Iggy. Iggy said he took influence from Jim Morrison of The Doors, but Iggy just made everything so much more extreme. He was known to smear peanut butter and hamburger meat on his chest.
That's a health hazard.
Oh, just wait. And cut himself with shards of glass.
Nope.
and he's even credited with inventing stage diving. The other band that laid the groundwork for punk was, well, one of the other bands, there was quite a few, was a New York City-based group called the Velvet Underground. They were managed by Andy Warhol. They played a lot of his art shows. Like, they were the house band for his art shows. They were super experimental, and many of their songs were described as, quote, just noise.
It seems like a great partnership.
Yeah. At the time, they were very unsuccessful, but now they were regarded as one of the most influential acts in the history of rock music. Most of the early punk rockers, especially those from the New York City scene, cite them as major influences. The base of early punk really came from New York City in the early 70s, especially in Greenwich Village, where bands like the New York Dolls performed. The New York Dolls were a super popular group that were known for outlandish style and performances.
I like that.
A few legendary bands all lived downtown and played the same clubs, most notably one named CBGB. What do you think CBGB stands for?
Can't bury gonorrhea, dude. I don't know.
You were doing well until the last letter, which is a B and not a D.
So gonorrhea was right?
No, it stands for Country, Bluegrass, and Blues.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does.
I was not going to get that.
Nope. It was opened in the East Village in 1973, and it was formerly a biker bar. The owner allowed two guys to book bands, and they started to book in some rockers instead of the more like country bluegrass they were looking for. Many of the punk pioneers all played their first shows there. Bands like Television, The Ramones, Blondie, Patti Smith, The Talking Heads, and Misfits all played their first shows there. There really isn't a more legendary venue than CBGB for punk music. CBGB officially closed its doors after Patti Smith's last show in October of 2006, and today the old bar is a retail store.
Of course it is.
Yeah, like I looked
sure
it up
that they
on
love that.
Google Maps, and it's just like a fashion, like a high-end fashion store, but there's like a little plaque either above the door or on the ground that's like, this used to be a very cool music venue. The bands that were all playing in New York were super unified. They played the same clubs, hung out at the same places, and formed a camaraderie, which is something that you see a lot with punk. The bands all know and like each other, with the exception of the lead singer of the Sex Pistols, who hated everyone that's not him.
Right. Well, that's just, yeah.
Yeah. It's a community of musicians, and they kind of grew up together and started to develop their own unique sounds, kind of all in this little community. In 1974, Patti Smith went to CBGB to see a band called Television play. They were seen as the ultimate garage rock band. The group's singer played a large role in creating the punk aesthetic. He wore his hair cropped and ragged. He wore ripped t-shirts and black leather jackets, which is kind of like traditional punk.
Yeah.
Patti Smith, who was a performance poet experimenting with a feminist take on rock, fell in love with the band Television. In June of 1974, she recorded a song called Hey Joe with the guitarist from Television that many people consider to be the first punk song.
Okay.
By the mid-1970s, punk music was taken over by a group called the Ramones. They highlighted that signature look that was created by the Television singer of ripped jeans and black leather jackets, which they say their jeans were ripped because that's all they could afford. So
back before you had to like buy really expensive ripped jeans like now.
They drew on sources ranging from the Stooges to the Beach Boys to create a super unique sound. They stripped their songs down to the barest minimum. They would shout 1, 2, 3, 4 at the beginning of every song as if they couldn't even understand basic rhythm. They played their first show at CBGB in August of 1974. By the end of the year, they had played 74 shows, each of them about 17 minutes long. But after seeing them for the first time, a music critic said, quote, "I couldn't believe people were doing this. The dumb brattiness," end quote. In 1975, Television released a record called Little Johnny Jewel, which was the wider world's first look at this band that were legends in the punk scene.
I forgot that was the band name for a minute.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was like, Television did what now? Who's the entity of Television? It took me a second.
The rest of the punk bands weren't really recording much at the time, so the music wasn't getting beyond these clubs that the bands were all like playing in. It wasn't stretching beyond the community. So this record was a turning point for punk music.
Yeah, interesting.
At this time, punk was more about the culture than the music.
Am I a punk, you know? I don't know. Do you know what a punk is? No. Nothing.
The bands didn't have a definite sound. They were just part of the same culture. And as you can tell, a lot of them weren't really focused on making their music great. They were just kind of like making stuff because they could.
So interesting because like you think about like music as a form of like spreading information and like unifying people and like having like this aesthetic or this like it groups people together, like, and that's cool and that's good, but they're using it like solely for that.
In 1976, punk took a massive leap forward with the release of the Ramones' debut album. The album is largely seen as establishing the punk genre and popularizing it. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame said about this album, quote, "When the Ramones hit the street in 1976 with their self-titled first album, the rock scene in general had become somewhat bloated and narcissistic. The Ramones got back to basics. Simple, speedy, stripped-down rock and roll songs.
With the narcissism.
Voice, guitar, bass, drums, no makeup, no egos, no light shows, no nonsense.
Oh.
And though the subject matter was sometimes dark, emanating from a sullen adolescent basement of the mind, the group also brought cartoonish fun and high-energy excitement back to rock and roll." End quote. It's really impossible to say all of the artists and genres that this album directly influenced. So while all of this was happening in New York, a punk movement started to grow up in London. A guy named Malcolm, who unofficially managed the New York Dolls for a while, moved back to London in 1965, heavily inspired by the New York music scene that he had left. He opened a clothing store named Sex that gained a reputation for its outlandish fashion. Members of a band called The Strand were frequent visitors to the store. Malcolm started to manage them, and they started looking for a new singer. Another Sex regular, who called himself Johnny Rotten, he auditioned and he won the job as the singer. They adopted a new name and played their first gig as the Sex Pistols in 1975.
I almost said sex shop, but like in the sex shop.
They never played at the store.
Damn.
I don't think it was set up to do that. They found a small but massively dedicated following. The Sex Pistols became the defining band of the UK punk scene. Other bands like The Clash also became large bands in the punk scene, but every other band sort of orbited around the Sex Pistols. They became quite famous for their love of chaos. They'd often work their audiences up into a near riot every single time they played.
That seems like psychopathic. Like it actually genuinely seems psychopathic.
Which I think is kind of the point. Malcolm saw them and positioned them as the forefront of the youth culture. They released a song called Anarchy in the UK, which became a punk classic. They also released a song called God Save the Queen, which became one of the most censored songs in the history of the UK. The Sex Pistols, although they were the forefront of the UK punk scene, only released one album and were only a band for 3 years.
What? I'm shocked.
I am. Like, the impact they had on music is massive for only being a band for 3 years.
It kind of seems like one of those like supernova moments where it's like
they burned a little bit too hot.
This is not gonna,
They broke up in 1978 after a turbulent tour of the United States. It was their first U.S. tour. In 1979, their bassist, who was seen as the superstar of punk and named Sid Vicious, was arrested for allegedly stabbing his girlfriend to death. While out on bail, he overdosed on heroin. So that was kind of the end of the Sex Pistols. By the late 70s, punk was no longer a little thing. It was an established musical genre. It exploded into the mainstream, and it started to split into various different subgenres. The second wave of punk music started around 1977, which is only a few years after the first wave.
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
All right.
By this point, punk spread to California, and a ton of bands started to crop up out there, like The Zeros, Black Flag, and The Weirdos. Also, a new crop of bands heavily inspired by the early CBGB days cropped up in New York, like The Misfits, who started to play a type of punk that was later called horror punk. The California bands were very diverse. They ranged from more commercial, pop-friendly sounds to aggressive and wild, which was known as hardcore punk. The California punk scene came from massive glam rock in the early 70s, and many of the major figures in that scene played a role in the punk scene. In 1975, a band of teenage girls formed called The Runaways. They were one of the first bands that released punk rock music, and they featured Joan Jett. The group started with Joan and the drummer both met a producer who helped them find other girls to round out the group. They were quickly signed to Mercury Records and went on tour, opening for massive acts like Van Halen and Tom Petty.
So cool.
Pretty quickly, they established themselves as members of the punk scene by hanging out with the Ramones, the Dead Boys, the Sex Pistols, and Generation X.
They had to deal with so much shit.
Oh yeah, 100%. By 1978, they had started to have disagreements about money and the direction of the band, so they officially broke up by 1979. They only existed as a band for 3 years, but they paved the way for so many other female artists, especially in the rock genre. Rock was, and in many ways still is, a massively male-dominated genre, so the Runaways and the members' later careers opened a window for women to kind of get into that genre. By 1978, there was a massive division in California punk. The punks in the suburbs of LA tend to focus more on hardcore punk with bands like Black Flag and Fear. The bands in Hollywood tended to be more artsy. The Hollywood punks disliked that the hardcore punks were more narrow in what they allowed to be called punk, and they were more violent. While the hardcore punks thought the Hollywood punks were not intense or serious enough about just things in general. By 1979, the hardcore punks won the war, and LA had been completely taken over by the hardcore punks.
Oh my God.
Some of the old LA punk bands went on to mainstream success, and some broke up, but hardcore now dominated the state. In the early 80s, a lot of the punk bands that are still associated with that California sound started to gain nationwide popularity. Bands like Black Flag and the Dead Kennedys showcased the hardcore side of California punk, while bands like Descendants showcased the surf punk style that tended to be a bit poppier. And I would say that this like poppier surf punk was the predecessor to pop punk.
Surf punk does not, I guess
it's just a little bit more melodic punk. Like think the Beach Boys surf music mixed with the aggressive punk. So like it's pop punk.
That made more sense.
It's Yellow Card. It's it's the early that. The Descendants, even though I'm wearing a Dead Kennedys shirt currently, Descendants are my favorite of this like era of California punk. Mm-hmm. They were fronted by a professional molecular biologist who like left the band for a bit when he went to college, and they released an album called Milo Goes to College because his name was Milo.
Oh my God.
He like has later come back and is now fronting this punk band full time after being a professional molecular biologist for a while. That's amazing. By the mid-1980s, many of the major punk bands started to break up or go in the direction of metal or hard rock music. Bands like Black Flag and Dead Kennedys, who carried the California scene in a lot of ways, had completely broken up. In many ways, punk music was set up to fail. At the very least, it was never intended to be mainstream popular. Punk music was all about subverting the mainstream. It was about tight community, and when it started to get that mainstream success, it lost the edge that made it punk. Punk rockers also had a bad habit of gatekeeping.
Yeah.
They decided what punk was, and anyone who wanted to try something even a little bit different, maybe a little bit progressive, a little bit better to push the genre forward, didn't fit in. And that led to many of the bands splitting off into subgenres when they wanted to kind of like evolve their sound and try new things.
Yeah.
When pop punk started to emerge in the 90s, which was kind of like the rebirth of this genre in many ways, the traditional punk bands refused to accept them. Punk music still exists, but you won't really hear it on the radio. It's still underground, which is kind of like, according to many punk rock purists, it's where it should be. So I guess they're happy with it.
If the people who are playing the music enjoy it, then great.
Yeah, but some people argue it is only there because punk purists won't let it grow into anything. Punk music has spawned countless genres, everything from alternative to new wave to post-punk to screamo. By the mid-1980s, this early stage of punk rock, the most pure punk rock, according to some, was over. As Rolling Stone wrote in 1985, quote, "Primal punk is passé. The best of the American punk rockers have moved on. They have learned how to play their instruments. They have discovered melody, guitar solos, and lyrics that are more than shouted political slogans.
Oh my God.
Some of them have even discovered the Grateful Dead," end quote.
Oh my God, that is so funny. Yeah. Oh my gosh. A+ rating.
By the end of the 80s, many of these bands were just called alternative rock. The spirit of punk has reemerged in major ways over the past few years, like the grunge scene, spearheaded by Nirvana in the 90s. So many of the underground, aggressive, anti-mainstream genres owe their origin to punk rock. So that's punk. How do you feel about it?
I'm all for subverting
Yeah.
genres and the way that people think, but if you want to call it music, please set it to a melody. Literally, you can say what you want to say, but set it to a melody. That's
Yeah.
like
I mean, I love...
stop gatekeeping.